Hello, lovelies, and welcome to yet another episode of Strange Playgrounds on this blisteringly, stiflingly, oppressively hot and bright evening. You'll hear me make this complaint a lot on my various videos, be they the Let's Plays, be they podcasts, be they reviews, or whatever. I hate the heat, I really do. On top of everything else that's going on at the moment, all of the external pressures, the issues, the problems, the anxieties, this weather just defeats me utterly. It defeats me utterly, and my only salvation from it, my only little bit of appeal is in fiction, in media, in isolating myself and just immersing myself in created worlds, to be honest, because I cannot abide humanity in this state. I cannot deal with humanity in this state. I'm too frustrated, I'm too annoyed. There's just too much. There's too many external pressures going on. And I haven't the patience. It takes all of my energy to deal with my day-to-day functioning and my work, which also involves my work by its very nature. My day job involves dealing with humanity. I'm a care worker. I work with people who have learning difficulties, so all of my energy goes to that, and I can't really be dealing with humanity outside of that in these circumstances. So I've just been losing myself in various forms of media. I've been diving headlong into short story collections, novels, comics, video games, anything. One of the things I revisited recently is it's a bit of an oldie. Not even, I can't even say an oldie but goodie, because it's not. It's an example of the old FMV horror gaming era. Do you remember that? It was sort of like the mid to late 90s. Video games took this really weird turn. Developers and studios got the idea that they could use live actors. They could shoot live footage and digitize it, like actors in front of green screens sometimes, or sometimes they could shoot them like movies and then digitize them and make that footage into video games. It didn't work. It was heralded at the time. Go back and look at the history of that era, the FMV era. It's so bizarre. It was heralded as though it was going to be the future of video games, that you wouldn't need to have like created sprites anymore. You wouldn't need to have like created graphics in a video game before. You could shoot them like films, and you could play as actors, actually like physically shot actors, and that was going to be the future of video games. They marketed it as though it was going to be like playing films. It was going to be like playing real life. Of course, it didn't come out that way. The compression methods that were required to digitize, to contain this footage on CDs resulted in really pretty terrible looking games, let's be honest, for the most part. And for the most part, the video games are terrible. They're absolutely terrible. The acting is appalling, because half the time the actors don't really know what they're doing. It's a new form of media at that time, and they really don't know what they're doing. They're poorly directed. The scripts are awful, and most of the time they didn't bother getting proper actors in to do this stuff. There's a few very notable examples of where they did. But for the most part, it's like, let's just get jobbing actor A in to do this role. Let's get the office temp to do this part. And also another big flaw with FMV video games is that often the actors don't know where they are. They're shot largely in front of green screen rather than in actual environments. So they don't really properly react to the environments they find themselves in. One of the best examples I can think of is probably one of the biggest examples of an FMV horror game, which was the original Phantasmagoria. Most FMV games of the era were horror-based, which is really weird to think, because it was largely before the time that horror video game horror video gaming had its renaissance with things like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and later on System Shock and that kind of thing. They occurred at a time when horror video gaming wasn't really that big a thing. Certainly not in Western markets, because video games were largely aimed at children. But Phantasmagoria, it was really big. It was a massive project. It had so much money poured into it. That's another thing with FMV games. They cost a lot more to make than normal video games did. Even though you didn't have to create everything from scratch, they cost a hell of a lot more to make, and a lot of studios they completely buried. Single projects completely buried entire studios back in the day because they were so expensive, and they never made their money back because they were largely awful. Phantasmagoria isn't awful. It's not terrible, but it's not very good either. In gameplay terms, all it is an old-fashioned point-and-click adventure. That's all it is. It looks interesting because rather than playing as like a drawn or digital sprite like Guybrush Threepwood in the Monkey Island games, you're playing as an actual actress. The creators actually shot the actress doing all of the necessary movements and motions for the video in order to make her the character that you play and direct around the playing area. It doesn't work. It doesn't look very good at all, and it's very annoying. The game itself is actually very annoying to play because you need pixel perfect precision in order to find all the little areas on the screen that you can interact with and activate. Also, the script is pretty terrible. It's supposed to be a horror game, but it's got no surprises whatsoever. I mean, it is so cliche. It's so cliche. It's essentially, yeah, it's every horror, it's every sort of Stephen King horror cliche you can possibly think of. So you've got this couple, they're kind of newly married, they're jobbing, one of them is a writer, the other one is a photographer. They don't have much money, but they end up getting a bargain, obviously, on this great, massive, abandoned mansion. And they, all the way through, they're wondering why they got such a good bargain. Can you guess why? Have you figured it out yet? It's that story, basically. It's that story, and not even done particularly well, and certainly with no surprises whatsoever. But it does have, for all of its faults and problems, it does have this camp value. It's quite fun in the sense that it's a bit silly. The mansion itself is such a video game environment. It doesn't even look real because the mansion is digitized. It's digitally created. Whereas the actors are live action, so they just look out of place, and half the time they aren't reacting to it. The mansion itself is like the hammiest gothic mansion you will ever see, complete with gargoyles, occult symbols on the floor. It's got all sorts of ridiculous arcane and occult shit all the way through it. It doesn't make any sense. There's no logic to it at all. But it's kind of fun and hammy in a sort of ghost train ride way. It's also very, 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 very violent and gory. So there's a couple of scenes in it where you get to see what happened to the previous occupants of the manor. It used to belong to a magician, a 19th century magician named Carno. And Carno, it turns out, summoned some demon from another realm, ended up possessed by it, and ended up killing all of his wives. He had 5 all in all. So, approaching Henry VIII levels. And you get to see sort of like mystical flashbacks where you see what happened to all of his wives. And all of the death scenes are actually really good fun. One of the things they did to make the game sell is that they cultivated deliberate controversy around it. So the newspapers did get a hold of this. And not only does it include lots of violence and gore, there's a sex scene in it, which was actually quite raunchy for the time and quite vivid, even though you don't really see anything, to be perfectly honest. It's like the softest of softcore porn and very badly done. But there's also, and this actually makes it quite squeamish and unpleasant, to be honest, there's also a rape scene in it, which is really unpleasant, and probably it's not paid off. It doesn't really earn it, If you're going to include something like that in a piece of media, then you need to earn it. There needs to be a reason for it, but there isn't. It's just shock value. I wouldn't be surprised if they inserted that scene retrospectively as a means of cultivating the controversy, as free marketing, you know. But I never played it at the time it came out. I was too young. I didn't even have a computer back then. It was PC only. But I sort of came across it in Let's Plays and whatnot later on, because it's kind of infamous. You know, it's part of video game history. And I haven't seen it for a long time, and I went back and rewatched like a playthrough of it recently. It's sort of hammy fun. It's really silly. It's badly acted. The characters are terrible. It's not good by any stretch of the imagination. But it's one of the few examples of an FMV horror game that actually did really well. It did so well, in fact, that it warranted a sequel, which is the absolutely atrocious Phantasmagoria 2, A Puzzle of Flesh, which a lot of you will know. I know a lot of you will know from the now classic Let's Play of it that the Spoony one did at the beginning of his career. Which is actually one of the best series of videos he ever did. They're so funny, because that game is so terrible. It's so remarkably terrible on every level. It's like all the sins of FMV horror all wrapped and cultivated together. It has everything that makes FMV horror and FMV games in general absolutely risible. The puzzles are ridiculous. They don't make any sense in any kind of real life setting, because they consist of things like, oh, it's a locked door. Well, I can just go and get a key, or I can force it. No. You've got to go and do this elaborate set of puzzles to get an item in order to jimmy it open. There's one puzzle at the very beginning which sets out how stupid they are. Your wallet, the main character's wallet is lost under his sofa, right? You could just move the sofa. It's not that big. It's not that hard. But no, you can't do that. You've got to get your pet rat to go under the sofa to bring it back out to you, but it's not that simple. You've got to lure the pet rat out with like a granola bar, which you find in the bedroom cupboard. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. There's no verisimilitude here. There's no sense of reality to anchor it. It's in that weird transitional phase where video games were still far too much video games, and yet not in but transitioning into legitimate storytelling mediums, but still far too much video games, still suffering from that legacy, yeah? So it doesn't work, it doesn't feel real. But I've sort of been going back through them and re-watching some of these old FMV horror games. They're so shit, but they are lots of fun. I've got to say, they are lots of fun. One of them I actually genuinely like is The Ripper. The Ripper is a sort of cyberpunk FMV horror game, and the game itself is pretty terrible. It's almost unbeatable. I mean, without a walkthrough, I have no idea how you do it, because the puzzles are just ridiculous. They require so much in the way of, I won't even say intuition. It's not intuition, it's blind luck. There's no logic to them, it is just blind luck, most of those puzzles. But what makes The Ripper is the cast. The cast is probably one of the best of any FMV horror game you will ever see. It's got an amazing cast of actors, proper actors, unlike any other FMV horror game. Burgess Meredith is in it. Burgess Meredith, who is absolutely brilliant at his hammy best. And at the end of his life as well, this may have been his last role, you know. He was like 86 when he filmed The Ripper. Christopher Walken. Christopher Walken in his most Walken role ever, just hamming it up, just gnawing the digitized scenery. It is absolute... Jimmy Walker's in it. And you're like, what? What? How the hell did that happen? It's just amazing. It's worth... I wouldn't say it's worth playing because it's a nightmare, but it's worth watching, definitely. It's worth watching a playthrough because it's so hilarious. Burgess Meredith and Christopher Walken using, like, cyberpunk, like, tech speak, hacker speak, as though they know what they're talking about, is bloody hilarious. It's one of the funniest things. The only example of an FMV horror game I could think of that I actually played and I really like, and I mean, it's problematic, it's not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, but it is something I really, really like, is Realms of the Haunting from Gremlin. Realms of the Haunting is one of the most comprehensive FMV horror games in the sense that the script is actually really good. It still has a lot of the issues that FMV horror has, but there's enough of a game in there and enough of an interesting narrative that you can sort of forgive a lot of the foibles and the flaws that it has. It doesn't allow the FMV elements to get in the way of the game elements, and the game elements don't generally get in the way of the FMV elements either. It's a sprawling affair. Came on, I think, 6 discs altogether. It's a massive game, really ambitious project. Features David Lerner, who was Pickle in Nightmare, and also lots of other characters as well. It's got a genuinely good horror story that involves occultism and Satanism and metaphysics and all sorts of weird and wacky and wonderful stuff. There's a sort of Dennis Wheatley quality to it, which I really appreciate. It does, I will warn you now, it's actually a very decent game and a very decent story right up until the end. The end chickens out. The end does a Dallas. It chickens out, and it gives you the laziest, most hackneyed, oh, it might have not been real, it might have all been in the main character's imagination sort of ending you could possibly imagine, and it kills it. I hate that. But the game itself actually is pretty good. It's so good, I actually finished it. And for me to finish an FMV horror game, that's not bad. That's not bad. Again, I would recommend going and watching a Let's Play rather than playing it yourselves, because it can be frustrating. There are certain puzzles that are absolutely nightmarish in it. If you miss one tiny little thing in one of the many, many massive, sprawling digitized dungeons in that game, you are screwed. There are areas where if you have forgotten certain written clues and you haven't written them down, you're done. You're not going to win. It's that kind of game. But actually, it does maintain a very decent atmosphere. The metaphysics of the game is really surprising. It seems to be very traditional initially. It's about demons and angels and like messiahs and whatnot. But actually, it marries that to this bizarre, slightly humanist metaphysics, and it's quite cool. It's actually not bad. I rather like it. I actually wrote a little short story in I think it's in Born in Blood Volume 2, or it may be in Volume 1 actually, which is partially inspired by the background of this game. See if you can figure out which one it is. See if you can figure out which one it is. There is actually a published short story out there that partially features some influence from the metaphysics and the background of this game. See if you can figure out which one it is. I actually really liked it, and I like the way it communicates its story. It's not bad. As FMV games go, it's bloody brilliant, actually. And it has some decent frights in it as well. It does have this really good atmosphere, and at times it can be genuinely disturbing. Not a bad piece of work. So I've been diving into those just as an immersion, as something to sort of take the edge off, you know? In terms of reading, I'm currently, for the next review in the Black Shuck Shadows series, I'm reading Paul Kane's one of Paul Kane's collections. I will reveal it when the video comes up, which will be sometime this week. But it's quite good. It actually revolves around werewolf narratives and their relation to atavism, to sort of human drives and the sort of animalistic side of humanity. They're not bad. Werewolf narratives, I find, are really difficult. They can be very, very difficult to sell because there's a tendency for them to be compared to vampire narratives. And for some reason, vampires seem to hold more of an appeal certainly to present-day postmodern readers. Vampires have way more appeal. I think it's because they're more romanticized. Vampires are more of a sort of sexualized and power fantasy than werewolves are. Werewolves represent a loss of control, whereas vampires operate in absolute control over everything. In fact, the status of operating as a vampire traditionally in fiction places you in the role of power, whereas the werewolf doesn't. For the most part, werewolves lose themselves werewolves in in their mythical states, in their liminal states. They lose all control and capacity when they become werewolves. It's often a tormented state, and often it's described as a disease rather than as a benefit or as a boon. But yeah, I will talk more about that actually when it comes to reviewing the actual short story collection. I've also been diving into a bit of Harlan Ellison, which is probably not the best thing to be reading in this particular cultural and political climate. Or, I suppose you could argue it's the best thing to be reading. I mean, Harlan's fiction... Harlan Ellison didn't like this himself. He actually... he railed against this quite vociferously, but there is a kind of... if not nihilism, there's a misanthropy in his work. That's for damn sure. There's a misanthropy that runs through his work, and it's actually part of the appeal. There is a grimness to it. There is a darkness to it. There is a lack of hope or faith in humanity in his work. And I actually really like that. I actually really like that. I find it quite honest. I find that... there are human beings who are just like that. I'm rather like that. I suffered and still suffer with a great deal of misanthropy. I vacillate between wanting to save humanity and then wanting to see the entire species burn in its own inadequacy, ignorance, and stupidity. It's a strange thing. It's a really, really strange thing. And it's something I've actually experienced and had to deal with since I was a kid. I remember having misanthropic thoughts when I was a child, very young, well before my teenage years and well before I reached double digits, But Harlan's fiction expresses that in a very poetic way and even mythologizes it in certain respects. I mean, I'm reading at the moment I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, read it many times before. Brilliant short story collection. The title story from that collection is absolutely amazing. Many of you will know it from the video game adaptation, the point-and-click horror game adaptation, which, whilst frustrating at times, is actually beautifully atmospheric. It's got this really, like the short story itself, it has this really dirty, grimy, nihilistic atmosphere about it. And I really like that. I really, really appreciate that. When writers and creators are willing to go to those depths, when they're actually willing to even alienate their readers, or certainly certain types of reader, in order to sustain that atmosphere and that ethos, I really appreciate it. Because there's something worth exploring there, isn't there? There is something in human experience that's worth exploring in that depth, in that blackness, even if it does evoke negativity, if it does evoke negative emotion. Negative emotion is something that's worth exploring and experiencing, certainly vicariously through fiction and whatnot. It's what it's for, surely. It's what created media is for. It allows you to explore those sides of both humanity and yourself, to confront and explore those parts of yourself that you would otherwise maybe shy away from, or find too difficult to explore in conversation or day-to-day life, or in face-to-face or immediate experience. It's worth it. I seek that out. I want it. I want those experiences. I want those associations in fiction that are going to, I suppose the common parlance would be, trigger me. And I don't mean that in the way that's generally used on the internet. It's become misunderstood, the term of triggering, because there are people who use it as a weapon. They use it as a way of condemning people for being apparently oversensitive or whatever. What triggering actually means in its legitimate interpretation is it's associative. Ultimately, it means that certain things within a certain aspects or situations in a bit of created media, in a story, in a video game, in a piece of art, may bring up certain associations with traumatic experience, yeah? And it may have the effect of flinging the audience back into those traumatic experiences, or the mindset, the emotional state they were in during those traumatic experiences. And everyone's had them. I mean, everyone's had traumatic experience. Our first experience is traumatic. You know, birth is probably one of the most traumatic things we ever experience. That's what my short story collection, Born in Blood, is about. That's exactly what it's about. That's where the term "born in blood" comes from, you know. And I like that. It's something I really want from my fiction. It's something I certainly want from horror fiction. I mean, horror fiction is so well placed to do that in a metaphorical or symbolic way or in a direct way, you know? Horror fiction is sublimely placed to do that, and I want it. I absolutely, desperately, deviantly want it. I crave it. I have a problem with fiction that leaves me feeling nothing. If I can get up and walk away from it and forget it, then it hasn't done its job. It has not done its job. I want to feel something. And if that feeling is negative, then so be it. It does mean you have to be careful, obviously. I mean, if you're in a bad state of mind, then it's a bad thing. You may not want to experience that. I mean, something I'm playing at the moment, Pathologic 2 is like that. I would not recommend that game to anyone who's experiencing depression. On the other hand, I may be wrong in that, because it may actually be a good depression game, like Dark Souls is for a lot of people, like Silent Hill is for a lot of people. It may help them to work through it, because it does have that depressive element, that depressive atmosphere. It's something I certainly find in Harlan Ellison's fiction. There is a degree of catharsis in it, where you go to the depths. He plunges you right down into the doldrums of blackest despair, of nihilism, of dystopia, of misanthropy. I mean, in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, it's over. Reality is over. Not the universe, but the world has ended in a cataclysmic war, and the only state that's left is being controlled on a molecular level by a dark god of our own creation, the computer Am, who was created to coordinate the worldwide wars that were erupting, but actually determined, after it achieved sentience, did a Skynet, it determined, well, humanity isn't worth saving. It was programmed to hate humanity, and that's what it does. It hates humanity so much that rather than just exterminating us, it selected 5 random human beings to save from the destruction, and it endlessly tortures them. It reconfigures them. It murders them in myriad ways, then reconfigures them on a molecular level, resurrects them, and changes them, transforms them, distorts them, surgically alters them, starves them. It tortures them endlessly and forever. Am is the hell of our own making, and that's what I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is about. It's awful, and it's brilliant, and it's so grotesque. It's utterly, utterly wonderful. I cannot really emphasize how worthwhile it is having that experience in fiction of going to those depths. I like it. I live for those experiences. I really do. And I think what I'm going to do after I finished I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, I'm going to transition into reading a bit more Philip K. Dick. I think I've got that sort of hankering. It's a mixture of reading Ursula K. Le Guin and Harlan Ellison at the same time, alongside lots of Warhammer 40,000 fiction as well, which I'm also reading. I'm currently reading Manflayer, which is the third book in the Fabius Bile series by Josh Reynolds. Expect a full review of that at some point. God, that's a good book. That's a really, really good bit of dark, pulpy horror science fiction. There's a lot of nasty, nasty, nasty stuff in that book. Well worth your time, but I expect a full review of that one. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been up to. It's a bit of it's not escapism, because I don't believe in escapism, as I've talked about in previous episodes of Strange Playgrounds. It's not escapism. You can't escape from the world in that way. It doesn't work. It's rather a means of coping with the world, of digesting it in a way, of allowing myself to synthesize it and to pick it apart piece by piece in metaphorical terms. That's what I find. That's how it works for me. When I come back, ladies and gents, there will probably be a bit of a fiction review. So until then, my dears, bye-bye!